like what people don't understand is like Democratic partisans are Democratic partisans. Like there's a people who vote Democrat like identify as Democrats. They're going to be pissed if you challenge the leader of the party for like no reason and like kind of like a lot of downsides, and they're not interested in voting for like these like obvious grifters like Marianne
like
Williamson
RFK Jr.
or Robert Kennedy Jr. or like whoever.
Hello and welcome to the Aaron Rupar Show. Today I'm excited to be joined by Noah Berlatsky. Noah is probably the most regular freelance contributor to Public Notice, where he's written all sorts of interesting, provocative pieces ranging from unpacking the Marianne Williamson presidential campaign to talking about gun violence in this country. And actually, just yesterday, he had a really thoughtful piece talking about Republican anti-trans bigotry and drawing some connections with eliminationist rhetoric in other societies and some of the dangers that poses going forward, kind of looking at that in a historical context, not just a political context. I first started working with Noah about a year ago now, just ahead of the birth of my son. When my son was about to arrive, I knew that I needed some freelance help, and I got connected with Noah because we were following each other on Twitter, and I really enjoyed his commentary there. So since then, he's been a regular contributor about once a week. And if you are a regular reader of the newsletter, you no doubt are familiar with his work. And we get into a lot of the different interesting things that he has written for the newsletter. So it's an interesting conversation, and I hope that you enjoy it. Next week, I am excited to be joined by Tim Mak. Tim is a freelance journalist who is living in Kyiv, Ukraine right now, covering the war there. So I'll be talking with him live from his apartment in Kyiv. That should be a fascinating conversation. So look for that next Thursday morning, along with every episode of the podcast these days. Please like the show where you can and share it amongst your circle to help spread the word. Without further ado, let's get into my conversation with Noah. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Aaron Rupar Show. I am thrilled to be joined today by Noah Berlatsky. If you are a reader of my newsletter, Public Notice, Noah probably needs no introduction because he has been writing for the newsletter for about a year now, and he also writes his own Substack called Everything is Horrible. You can also read him. I know you've been published, Noah, in Mashable, and where else are you writing these days if people want to find your work?
I write for The Independent semi-regularly. I write for the Chicago Reader. I do arts criticism for the Chicago Reader. A couple other places. The easiest thing to do is just follow the Substack, I guess, and I have a roundup where I link to everything I wrote that week. So
yeah, and you are extremely prolific as a writer. I mean, I'm sometimes amazed when you and I touch base once a week to kind of talk through post ideas for your work in Public Notice, how quickly you can turn really thoughtful stories around that are very in-depth, with a lot of good analysis and context. And so certainly, that's stuff that I think, unless, if you're reading your work, I think it shines through, but especially when you edit someone's work, you can really pick up, especially someone like myself who's been editing now for, about a decade. You were one of the easiest people who I've ever edited in terms of, filing a draft and having it ready to be published. So, that's certainly an impressive skill that you have.
It's, I've been freelancing for 20 years. And the only way to make money. I mean, if you want to make a living, you've got to be fast.
I suppose. Yeah.
Well,
that's why, I was kind of amazed, not to get too into left field here, but that the Tim Alberta piece in The Atlantic, which basically led to Chris Licht's ouster. Did you have a chance to read that?
I haven't read it. I mean, I sort of read about it, but
it's a really good piece, and I'm sure a lot of listeners have read it because it was, a huge news story over the past week or so. And I know Tim Alberta, who wrote that, has been doing other work over the past year. It's not like this was the only thing that he did, but the long and short of it was that he basically spent the better part of the last year shadowing around Chris Licht, talking to him, kind of being even like shadowing him to his workouts. And so, the amount of time invested in reporting a story like that. I think, you're probably similar to me where, I've worked on some things that have taken weeks or maybe up to like a month or so, but to be able to spend a year on something. I mean, obviously the Atlantic has a lot of resources. They can afford to, put a very talented writer on a story like that basically turns out like a short book of sorts. But if you, are kind of hustling like you are, like I am with the newsletter, it's usually kind of more quick turns, or, sometimes you do kind of iterative coverage where maybe you're covering a story where you do a lot of different blog posts or newsletters over a period of time. But, the currency of the game that you're in and my game is kind of turning around things pretty quick.
Yeah, I would say that's right. I have trouble even imagining what it would be like to have the resources to do something for a year. I did write a book, and
I wasn't aware of that. Okay.
Yeah, I wrote a book about Wonder Woman. The
Oh,
original
wow. Okay.
The original Wonder Woman comics back in 2014 for Rutgers University Press. Um, that was something I'd been I mean, I sort of like was blogging about the original Wonder Woman comics for a long time, like a year, more than a year. So, I sort of done a lot of research. I still don't quite know how I managed it though, because, I mean, it's an academic book, so I didn't really,
Oh,
I mean, they paid me a
okay. That's
little, but
interesting. See, and that's something I know nothing about, so I can't even
the
banter. I mean, I'm aware of Wonder Woman, but beyond that, I think I've probably seen some cartoons with her. Now having young
original, well,
kids, I'm sure I'll get
have
there
you heard
soon.
about, the original writer, William Marston, lived in this polyamorous relationship and was very into, I mean, he was basically this kind of weird gender theorist who thought women should rule.
Oh, I wasn't aware of that.
And
Okay, there's layers
oh,
to this
oh,
apparently.
oh yeah, yeah. There's been there was a movie. There's been kind of Jill Lepore wrote a book about it. I don't know. She's a pretty famous historian. Um, but yeah, I mean, so the original comics are all kind of bondage and
Interesting
crazy
that it became.
matriarchies, and yeah,
Yeah.
it's super fun.
Yeah,
So
I mean
anyway,
that's something that I kind of grapple with these days is, especially given the type of work I do, trying to be immersed in cable news and like, media, political events. I've been reading, I always have at least one or two nonfiction books that I'm reading at a given time, but to find time these days to read fiction, it's kind of a failing of my own, but it's also just like there's only so many hours in a day, and that's kind of the one thing right now that I've sort of cast aside. But having very little kids these days, 1 and 3 years old. I mean, we're watching these days a lot of like Bluey and stuff that there could be interesting layers to it, but I'm so not really paying attention to it when it's on that the kids like it and it keeps them occupied for windows of time where either I can
it's
do a little bit of work or do something else around the house that needs to get done. And so
it's tricky when you have kids for sure. My daughter's 19 now, so she's I mean, she's still here. She's gonna be going to school around here, but yeah, I don't.
yeah.
It's not the same. But
Well,
I'm writing poetry now. That's kind of
yeah, I've noticed
the
that.
the hobby I'm doing. So
Yeah.
yeah,
I mean very prolific, not only with your journalism and your criticism, but also poetry. So
right.
I'm
Yes,
guessing the vast majority of people listening to this probably already follow you if they're readers of the newsletter. But if they don't, it's N Berlat on Twitter. Also, Everything is Horrible on Substack. And actually, you mentioning your daughter is maybe a good jumping off point for your piece that you wrote in the newsletter today, because I don't think this is kind of inside information. Your daughter is trans, and
that's
your
right. Yeah, I've
piece,
written about that a few times.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. And your piece today in Public Notice is basically drawing some of the parallels between Republican anti-trans bigotry, some of the eliminationist rhetoric that is used in that context, and genocidal campaigns historically, whether we're talking about Native peoples here in America or Nazi Germany. I think a lot of people reject those sorts of comparisons out of hand, because I think for many, kind of the lived experience of being in America, especially if you're a white person, a white man in particular, it still kind of feels like we can, read the books we want to read, vote for who we want to vote for, and broadly do what we want to do. you having a trans daughter obviously gives you a little bit of a different window into that part of our politics, kind of the culture warring and the bigotry that is at the core of the Republican Party these days. But do you think that has gotten worse in recent years? I mean, I'm sure you've been very sensitive to this, having a trans daughter. It seems to me like, Republicans have really kind of escalated, trying to turn pride into kind of this toxic thing, or any sort of anodyne expression of solidarity with the LGBT community. Is that your sense as well?
Yeah, well, I mean, let me start with what you're talking about, of people being kind of resistant to the idea of there being sort of of what basically of Nazi analogies or of fascist analogies, or of the idea that there's kind of some genocidal intent. Um, I think people are sort of reluctant to sort of like think about that for sort of a range of reasons. Um, One that you pointed out is that it's easy to sort of like live in the US and not to really feel targeted. And most of our representations of like genocidal regimes or totalitarian regimes, you watch television, right? And it's like, or you watch the movies, and the representations tend to be like very totalizing,
Mm-hmm.
right? I mean, if you watch The Handmaid's Tale, right? Gilead is omnipresent, right? I mean, like they have like total control over sort of like everybody within their jurisdiction,
Mm-hmm.
and everybody's life is sort of like intimately impacted. Um, and that's sort of typical, or 1984, right? It's this very totalizing authoritarian regime, and the point, and often those representations, the I mean, in 1984, the main character is this white guy, right? And kind of the point is that like this kind of like middle class white guy, his life is like totally restricted
Mm-hmm.
by this totalitarian regime. And so that's what people think of when they think of, the Nazis, or when they think of genocidal regimes. They think, well, I'm, here we are, right? On a podcast saying, the right wing is horrible.
Yeah,
And
right.
nobody's breaking through the doors, right?
Yeah.
um but when you actually read about sort of like how regimes worked, um I mean, like, Jim Crow, right? I mean,
Yeah.
like during the early 20th century in the US, most people, like if you weren't black, right? I mean, you had a lot of, people thought of it as a democracy, right? People still think of that as a democracy. People say,
Mm-hmm.
well, that was a democracy, even though, there was basically this like huge prison camp in the South, I mean, like this, and black people like couldn't vote, and were, faced just like horrific violence. But people are like, well, yeah, that was a democracy. And, even you read about, what life was like under the Nazis. There's this great book by Claudia Kuhns called The Nazi Conscience, um, which is basically about how the Nazis sold genocidal programs, or how they made those feel like they were okay. Um,
Yeah. I think you. Yeah.
and it was very much that there were people who, um, I mean, there was even dissent. People sort of feel like the
Mhm.
Nazi regime a lot of, there was dissent. I mean,
Yeah.
people would refuse to honor, uh, um, people would refuse to honor boycotts of Jewish businesses. People would talk about how they weren't happy with sort of like Jewish violence. Hitler, early on was very reluctant to like say anything anti-Semitic. Like Mein Kampf was in 1925, and that was very, very anti-Semitic. But once
Right.
he gained power, he really avoided that because it wasn't popular.
Yeah.
And I think people, don't. So people kind of like
There's
see
there's a lot of
think of it
focus
as
on. Yeah.
totalizing, but it isn't. It
Well,
wasn't
it,
really.
it takes
I
it
mean,
takes a while to get there. I
it
think it's
takes a
part of the
while to
point.
get
and
there.
and there's a lot more. There's a lot more history and media about Nazi Germany, roughly 39 to 45 than there is 33 to 39. Like we focus more on kind of the end state rather than some of the processes and developments that kind of got the society there in the first place. And I think that's part of the comparison here, is that you have to be kind of sensitive to particularly with trans people, how they're being excluded from public life, how that identity is being made toxic. You get in your piece today for public notice about how there are efforts to remove trans children from their parents in certain states, and to block even adults from medical treatments. And so it's important to pay attention to some of these developments that maybe for yourself living in Illinois or me in Minnesota are kind of on the margins and aren't affecting us necessarily here. But, there is a world where, if DeSantis wins next year and Republicans control both chambers of Congress, I mean, we're really only one election cycle away from, some of the legislation that we're seeing, like in Florida, for instance, being pursued on a national level.
Right. And it's also, it's very, very scary in some of these red states now. I mean, it's also, one possibility is, that kind of we have, sort of, basically that's what happened in Jim Crow, right? I mean, there were certain states that were very repressive, and then, other states that were sort of more, less repressive, depending on who you are. But, it affects everyone. We're kind of worried about traveling to Florida now,
Yeah.
because there's pretty aggressive bans on trans people in public, using public restrooms, and it's kind of like, well, what do you do? you know
Right.
it just makes it really scary. The thing I was going to talk about, you mentioned, has it gotten worse? And I think it absolutely has gotten worse for LGBT people over the last couple of years. I mean the thing that's been happening with the right, I think, since before Trump, but especially since Trump, there's been this kind of move from marginalized group to marginalized group, sort of trying to organize around excluding and targeting them, sort of seeing how that works as an electoral issue,
Mm-hmm.
seeing how that works as a, you know, it's both about it's both about trying to use it to win elections, and then about using elections to sort of like target people, when you
Yeah.
win
I mean, we
elections.
had, of course, Trump infamously proposed a Muslim ban in
Right.
2015. Yeah, but the
Right.
other thing that's kind of interesting in this connection that your comments are causing me to reflect on is that if you remember, I think it was in 2015, maybe it was in 2016, the infamous images of Trump holding up a pride flag, and I think scrawled on it, it was LGBT for Trump or something like that, and that actually prompted, that was the source of some of the commentary during the primary about how Trump was actually outflanking Hillary on the left on LGBT issues, which was always preposterous. But, it was kind of those token gestures that sort of tricked, some progressive commentators, or at least ostensibly progressive commentators, into buying that Trump was kind of this different type of Republican. And the idea, here we are, 6-7 years later, the notion of Trump, during one of his rallies holding up a pride flag at this point, is unfathomable, or DeSantis for that matter, especially DeSantis. And so I think that's just kind of one image, or, one kind of thought experiment that I think, sort of reveals how things have changed in a relatively short period of time, where again, there's been this concerted effort on the right to make LGBT identities toxic and to sort of purge that from public life.
Yeah. And of course Trump went after immigrants.
Right.
That was sort of his big push in 2016, and then in 2018, there was all this stuff about the migrant caravan, which kind of, led to the shooting at Tree of Life Synagogue. And
And that's just become
you know
part
and,
of the Republican brand now. I mean, that's still a
Mhm.
strong undercurrent of Republican politics.
And Democrats have kind of, Joe Biden's immigration policy is pretty bad. Like, it's sort of, there's been a lot of ground ceded, I think. Um,
Yeah, I
and
mean,
of
yeah,
course,
it seems like he's mostly trying to ignore the issue, or not indulge right-wing efforts to make it, kind of like issue number one, where we need to build the wall, we need to, and I get that politically, that trying to ultimately it's a congressional issue, right? Though, there needs to be some sort of legislation. There's only so much that the executive can do, to straighten out whatever issues are at the southern border, to kind of, get control over what's happening there. But, my sense of Biden's stance on immigration is that he's trying to mostly ignore it, for better or worse, and maybe for worse.
Yeah. And then there's a lot of, there's obviously always targeting of Black people, especially after the George Floyd protest. But, there's, DeSantis is also trying to censor Black history in Florida. And,
Yeah, which is, there's some complexity to that, because it's more that, at least in terms of my understanding what's happening in Florida, they've created conditions where any parent can basically challenge a book in the library. And so one of them that was challenged, that became a big national story, was a book about Roberto Clemente, the baseball player experiencing racism in the US, that was challenged, which the fact that was removed from libraries became this huge story. And there is a sense in which DeSantis is trying to censor this, but he, with some plausible deniability, has been saying, look, this is not something I want to censor. But again, when you kind of create the conditions where any book can be challenged by any parent, there's been stories now more recently of parents challenging the Bible and that being removed from libraries. And so, it's kind of a reductio ad absurdum of legislation of that sort in the first place.
Yeah, he does see, he talks a lot about, how we need to not teach kids that, how kids will be
True.
damaged if they learn about racism.
Right.
And he,
the CRT stuff. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And they went after the school in Florida, right?
Yep.
They sort of took over a school. But anyway, I think definitely, DeSantis's focus, and the focus of increasingly, has been on LGBT rights, and especially on trans people. Trans people made, the thing about trans people made real gains in the last, 10 years, even 5 years, that people are,
Biden appointed a trans woman as I believe she's like the secretary of the army or something like that. I might have the specific office, right? Because that was a big controversy when that happened. But a very high-ranking military post. Yeah.
Just thinking about my daughter, I would say, I wouldn't say her school was perfect, but there was I just think about like what would have happened if somebody come out of trans when I was a kid, right?
Yep.
It would have been really a disaster. It just would have been impossible, and now, that's, I was in northeastern Pennsylvania, which is more conservative, and it was, 30 years ago, 40 years ago. But, the difference, in Chicago, people knew what it was. There was efforts to sort of like accommodate in terms of like restroom facilities. There were a lot of trans kids. It's just more visible, and sort of like more people understand what it is. So there's more, people talk about that as contagion, but it's not contagion. It's just that people are able to sort of like see that as a possibility for themselves, and it not be, and it doesn't have to be, like a disaster.
It's not dissimilar. Yeah, it's not dissimilar from 100 years ago, where more and more people are left-handed, and it's like, no, they're not. Right. It's just
exactly.
It's become acceptable and more normal to be left-handed. So,
and so, and there were healthcare options. But this is, this is part of, so that's kind of the good thing. Like in many ways, the society is a lot more welcoming, and it's a lot more possible to be trans. And my wife and I were, informed on trans issues, and very, had sort of talked to her about them before we knew she was trans. So, she knew that we were accepting, and we knew, it's just a very different situation than it would have been previously. But, along with that visibility, it's a backlash. This is kind of how it always works. If there's progress, there's often a reactionary backlash. And so, there's this huge effort, which, has been abetted by mainstream media, by like the Atlantic and the New York Times, have given.
It's very much presented as a valid side of a debate, being a bigot essentially. And you see this especially with right-wing media, which is kind of its own thing, but how they've kind of normalized people being really mad about pride, or things that I think most of us who are well adjusted are just fine with, seem pretty normal. But the effort, especially over the past couple of years, especially to make this kind of toxic and to platform bigots essentially as responsible voices, taking a side in a political debate. And I think that has spilled over to mainstream media a bit as well. And it's kind of surprising to me because I really felt, I got into this a little bit last week with Nikki McCann Ramirez. She's a politics writer at Rolling Stone, but she used to be at Media Matters. And, just how it really kind of felt, in the wake of the 2015 Supreme Court decision, basically banning discrimination in same-sex marriages, that, it felt like conservatives had kind of taken the loss on this one. And, it seems like it's really become more of a thing since Biden took office. And I'm not sure if that just became like a convenient kind of culture war crutch to use to attack Democrats, or what accounts for that. But that's been my experience, at least as someone kind of immersed in the media end of this, is that, it's become much more of a live issue the last couple of years. And, it didn't really work out that well for Republicans in the midterms, which you've also written extensively about, including in my newsletter, just the fact that, given where Biden's polling was at heading into the midterms, it was kind of surprising how well Democrats did. And, Republicans were running really heavy on the culture war at that time. But, it doesn't really seem like they took that information and used it to make any sort of political adjustment at this point.
No, I mean, so I think like it's still like it's quite unpopular, this sort of anti-trans stuff, and a lot of the anti-LGBT stuff is, I mean, it's not, I think that actually like abortion rights are kind of like related to that. And and taking those away is like super unpopular. So yeah, this stuff isn't popular. And so the thing that Republicans are doing is they're trying to build this consensus by framing it around children, and by presenting LGBT identities as like sexual abuse, basically. And again, I mean, like, there are precedents for that, because like, in Nazi Germany, Jews were very assimilated. Like, there was not like there was certainly anti-Semitism, but it wasn't. I mean, people look to Germany as a place where there was like, less anti-Semitism, or as a place where, that wasn't
In the
really
20s. Yeah. Right.
huge problem. And I mean, one of the things Hitler did was looked at sort of how the US discriminated against black people, to sort of like figure out how to like create a consensus against Jewish people, like, and sort of like the conclusion was, well, you can just like if you just start to sort of like discriminate against people ad hoc, you can sort of like build a consensus that that's the right thing to do.
Yeah.
The other scary thing is that, I mean, you don't need, like, on the one hand, it's kind of like, okay, it's not popular, so that's good and sort of heartening, but you don't exactly need a majority support to put in place a lot of discrimination and violence.
Right.
Like,
well, I think the clearest example of this is, and this is a slightly different issue, but where Republicans, when it comes to guns, are like overwhelmingly on the wrong side of the issue, where it's like 80% of Americans, when they're polled, say they want more gun restrictions, not fewer. And yet, in these red states, I mean, even House Republicans, I think, or maybe it's both House and Senate next week, are taking up a bill that would basically prohibit a restriction on pistols that I think is in place right now, basically rolling back additional gun restrictions. And, that's like a 20% viewpoint, but they, they're successful in enacting legislation of this sort in many instances.
Right, and the same with abortion rights. I
Yeah.
mean, like those are people are overwhelmingly opposed to the Republican position. Even like Republicans aren't, on board with a lot of this legislation, as you can see in places like Kansas, where they put it on the ballot. They put, should we they basically put like abortion restrictions on the ballot in this red state, and they got thumped. You know, um, but if you've got, I mean, because the sort of like Republicans are advantaged in a lot of ways by um, things like the Senate.
The Senate, yeah, for
The
sure.
Senate is a big one, but also the Electoral College, also gerrymandering. It's easier to gerrymander Democrats because they're concentrated in cities.
Yeah.
Um, you know, it's you could just they have a lot of leeway to sort of like put in place really draconian, you know, cruel policies, and even with like a pretty small minority. And uh yeah, I mean, and I mean, like places like Texas and Florida, I mean, like, a lot of people live there, but and they're sort of like relatively narrow Republican majorities, which can really make life kind of unendurable for um queer people and black people and women, and kind of any of these groups that they want to target.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. One thing I want to ask you about that's kind of related to this conversation that I think is also kind of a recurring theme in your work. But it's something that I sometimes, struggle with. I mean, like yourself, I've read extensively on, Nazi Germany, 20th century authoritarianism more broadly, I would say. But like to, or oftentimes will use the word fascism to talk about what's happening, especially obviously with Republicans in the US right now. How would you define that as like as a brand of politics that distinguishes it from other forms of authoritarianism that people might commonly think about? Because I think in some applications the word can be used in kind of a lazy way or like a catch-all. I know that that's not the way that you use it, but how would you kind of specify what fascism is?
yeah, I mean, I think that the sort of like main, and I'm sort of like thinking about definitions by like people like Jason Stanley and Robert O. Paxton. Um, I mean, I think the core of fascism is this sort of um, like I should have written this down, but essentially the big issue is um, that fascism sort of like defines an in-group and an out-group in terms of sort of like purity. There's a belief that there's a pure community. The Volk, is what the fascists called it, but you could say in the US it's white people. And that those are basically and that's the only legitimate source of political power. And then, and that, there are kind of other marginalized people who are not in that community who are a threat and who need to be excluded from power and controlled and exterminated. And so fascist authoritarianism is justified as needed in order to like control these marginalized populations, and then that authoritarian power is used to crush marginalized people. And I think that's pretty different from like, I don't know, like communist totalitarian regimes have like, I mean, sometimes take like
Yeah,
parts of that,
there was
but
definitely an in-group and an out-group in like Soviet communism. It was
right,
the
right. I
working
mean, and
class
that's
was,
sort of
yeah,
like, you could say, but there's kind of like the ideological justifications are pretty different. I
yeah,
mean, fascist regimes, the Nazis were like quite explicit about, only the Voc matter and these other groups are just filth. And Republicans, I mean, history's gone on and sort of like making those arguments is now more controversial because we know what happened in the Holocaust. But I mean, Republicans are often pretty straightforward about that the laws shouldn't really that that there should be different standards for themselves and for others. And that's
Sure.
often sort of like criticized as hypocrisy, but I think it's like it's not really hypocrisy. It's that they literally think that white men and conservatives, I mean it kind of like the edges blur, but basically
Yeah.
white male conservatives have a different standard because they're the actual people who matter, and everybody else needs to be controlled and policed.
Yeah. Well, there was some
um
of that. I mean, I think, some clear examples of that were, if we reflect back on the months following the 2020 election, Trump basically explicitly trying to disenfranchise voters in Detroit, in Philadelphia, and these, largely black, in many instances, Milwaukee, another one, these cities where, under the pretense of there being some sort of election fraud. But, I think that was also, that was in group, out group, but it was also trying to control certain communities. Yeah, I think you're right that there is, it's a little harder to think of examples of the double standard mentality. Although with Trump, I mean, it's often kind of dressed up around the guise of, very legal and very cool, or, when you're the president, you can do whatever you want kind of thing.
well,
So, yeah.
you can see it with Daniel Penny, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
I mean, like this law and order stuff, right? I mean, Republicans are all about, oh, you've got to follow the law unless you're a white vigilante. I mean, the
Yeah.
law and order stuff is always framed. It's always like, the law is always actually like, white male
Whatever
hegemony,
you
right?
interpret it. Yeah. And similar with a lot of like the stand your ground,
Right,
shooting people who look at you the wrong way, or, piss
right.
you
It's
off in
like,
traffic. Yeah.
right. Um, so, yeah. And I think, people will, I mean, I think the thing about fascism, I mean, Jason Stanley kind of talks about this a lot. I mean, like US fascist history arguably goes back before the Nazis. I mean, um, American genocide of native peoples was an inspiration for the Nazis. American uh treatment of black people was an inspiration for the Nazis. I mean, the US has, I mean, this kind of white supremacy, um, which I think is core to fascism, you know, um, sort of white nationalism or in-group nationalism. Um, yeah, I mean, that's been around for a long time. I mean, you look at the Ku Klux Klan. I mean, that looks like a fascist movement in a lot of ways.
Mm-hmm.
I think people, I mean, there are kind of other characteristics that people talk about, like a charismatic leader. And they say, well, the US has less of that. Though now there's Trump, so he's
Yeah.
kind
There's
of
also the alliances with big business, at least in like the Italian and German
uh,
context.
right.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I mean, like I feel like those are kind of less important and
Yeah.
vary more from place to place, but the sort of like core idea of sort of like um a pure community which needs to crush outsiders is, seems like the most important bit to
Well,
me in
that's
that.
right. Well, and that came through very clearly in DeSantis's speech, where he launched his presidential campaign. He said that he will destroy leftism in this country, which I think that's pretty close to his direct quote on that. And that's certainly, if a Democrat came out and said, "I'm running for president to crush right-wing extremism," or I guess extremism is kind of its own thing, but leftism is pretty anodyne. If someone said, I'm here to crush the Republican Party or something like that, I mean, that would be, there'd be special Hannity coverage that would last for weeks, if not months, I think.
Well,
Yeah.
the mainstream media gets freaked, sort of has a double standard there too. I mean, there's kind of the thing is that, you know, I mean, there's like, like a lot of these mainstream pundits aren't fascist, but they're kind of racist. I mean, like racist logics are very powerful and very present in the US. And, fascists take advantage of that. They take advantage of the fact that when you say, you know, this white party is fascist and dangerous, people say, well, those are like white people at Ohio diners. They're
Yeah.
they're they're the they're the heart of America. And they get upset and they feel like you're attacking America.
Yeah.
But
I
if you
think of it
say,
yeah. No,
but if you know,
go ahead. Yeah.
but if Trump says, Chicago is a shithole, pundits are like, oh, that's kind of funny, or oh
Yeah.
well, oh, he shouldn't say that, but they don't see it as like attack on America because it's like obviously like an attack on black people, and like
Yeah.
they're just like reflexively not considered part of the pure community, even by kind of mainstream pundits.
Well, that's interesting that you put it that way, because I tend to think of it more as appeasement than, being like ideological fellow travelers. And, you kind of got into this a little bit, or I guess it was a little bit of a subtext of your post today, which was framed around the Nikki Haley town hall on CNN, or at least it led with that on Sunday, where, Nikki Haley, the piece opens with this. She basically tried to link polling that shows that cis teen girls have relatively high rates of contemplating suicide, or some polling showing that.
I don't even think it's cis
Yeah, I
teen
don't.
girls. I
Well,
think it's just
that's what she was
girls.
saying. Yeah,
Yeah, she was claiming that.
yeah,
Yeah,
and I'm not exactly sure what polling she was referring to, but basically she said that it's like a third of teen
she's echoing
girls.
Matt Walsh.
Yes,
It's a
right, and
Matt Walsh talking point.
so, but the point of what she was trying to say is that one of the reasons for this, as she puts it, is biological boys and girls locker rooms. And obviously there's been no link established between that. I mean, that's part of the broader project which we've been talking about, of making trans identities toxic and kind of marginalizing them. But one aspect that we did not get into in the newsletter, but I posted a tweet kind of fleshing this out, is that the moderator, Jake Tapper, instead of pushing back on this, kind of indulged the framing, pivoted to a comment that was on point, basically saying that there's also really high rates of suicidal thoughts and suicide attempts among the trans community, but like did not really push back on the underlying assertion, this linkage that Nikki Haley was trying to make between trans youth and, teens being suicidal more broadly. And so to me, that to me was kind of an example of how I think a lot of these pundits or journalists, kind of bend over backward to appear fair to both sides, or kind of privilege bigoted viewpoints as being a valid side of a debate. And so, I've tended to think about that, at least in more mainstream contexts, through more of an appeasement frame than like a, sympathetic frame necessarily. But I, certainly when you get into Fox, Newsmax, further right wing.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that, I think it's like, it's dodgy and uncertain, right? Because I mean, CNN has definitely made a turn to the right, and that seems to be in part about some sort of ideological sympathy with the right by the people in charge, by Chris
The
Licht,
former
maybe.
people. Yeah. Chris Licht, RIP, I guess. Or yeah, he's not dead, but he's no longer he's no
Oh,
longer
is he
running
gone?
CNN. Oh, you missed that. Yeah, that was the big story this morning. He was ousted as the head of CNN. So which
Right.
yeah, I think I mentioned that in passing earlier in the context of that Tim Alberta
Right,
Atlantic piece that ended
right.
up being
Yeah.
kind of his downfall. But
Yeah.
his legacy lives on, because tonight there is a Mike Pence town hall on CNN. Next week there is a Chris Christie town hall on CNN. So his impact will be felt at least tonight and into next week with some of these Republican town halls.
When I see, Jim Acosta sort of like letting her get away with that too, I mean, I see somebody who doesn't know a lot of trans people.
Well, it
right?
was Jake Tapper.
Jake
just to be
Tapper,
clear.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Thank you.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, Acosta is an interesting character in all of this because, he was known as being like this, left of center, kind of rabble rouser during the Trump era. As he was accused of assaulting an intern over a doctored video at one point. And the Tim Alberta piece kind of got into this without naming Acosta's name, that Chris Licht had dinner. The subtext was very clear that it was with Acosta, and they had come to some sort of agreement that he would tone it down a little bit. And when you watch his shows on weekends, he hosts a weekend show where he has a lot of Republicans on there, and he will still kind of grill them, ask some tough questions here and there, but he doesn't really go for the jugular. It's more kind of like sparring rather than, really having like a hard hitting interview. So it'll be interesting even as soon as this weekend to see if that changes now that Chris Licht is out, and, if the direction kind of reverts back to where CNN was, as recently as a year ago, before Chris Licht took over. But I do want to pivot to one other topic here before I let you go in the final few minutes that we have left. That's a little bit less bleak. If you made it this deep into the podcast, you're probably okay with, bleak and somewhat heavy conversation. But, in case you're kind of jonesing for something a little bit lighter, I saw that you had kind of an interesting exchange, or I guess you mainly quote tweeted. It wasn't really, I did not see if you replied or not, but with Cenk Uygur, in response to a tweet that he posted basically saying that Biden is doomed next year because his polling is in the 30s and this guarantees a Republican win. You've written a little bit about this in my newsletter, but, for those who haven't read that, what is your optimistic case? And I don't even know if it's necessarily optimistic. I think it's just kind of the rational case for, Biden having a strong chance of winning a second term next year.
Well, the biggest issue is that like polling this far out just like has nothing to do with anything. Reagan, before his huge second term victory, his polls were crap.
Because the economy was terrible, and
this far out, right. Yeah. So that's the first thing. The second thing is Biden's polls now are about what they were going into the 2022 midterms, and he had a huge historic victory. So and that's not to say that if his polls are bad going into 2024 that he'll have a huge historic victory. It's just like we kind of don't know, we don't really know what's going on. Like, are polls not as predictive? What what's going to happen with his polls in a year and a half? What's going to happen to the Republican Party? Like, I wouldn't, that party is not healthy. Like, the front runner is like, facing like multiple indictments. There's kind of just like, you just can't predict anything like a year and a half out. And, like people sort of like hitting the panic button. Well, Cenk is sort of like, was like claiming that there's some sort of like, Democratic conspiracy to like prevent, other party figures running and to like, sideline outsiders. And it's all just nonsense, J.B. Pritzker and Meg Whitmer aren't running for like the very simple reason that they think they lose.
Yeah.
And it
would make them toxic going forward to do
right.
That.
And they lose, you lose, like running and losing a big primary, like always has a cost. Mm-hmm. It's a sitting president, people don't generally challenge the sitting president because like, because it's like a huge risk. There's an incumbency advantage, and people are just the people who are in the party, like not the like like it's not like people on top are manipulating it. Like what people don't understand is like Democratic partisans are Democratic partisans. Like there's people who vote Democrat like identify as Democrats. They're going to be pissed if you challenge the leader of the party for like no reason and like kind of like a lot of downsides, and they're not interested in voting for like these like obvious grifters like Marianne
like
Williamson
RFK Jr.
or Robert Kennedy Jr. or like whoever it's like these like these like very canny pundits are like who often kind of some of these people are not really Democratic partisans. I mean, they're kind of, there's kind of this part of the left that's kind of anti-democratic partisans even. And I'm not like necessarily like that's
Yeah,
I mean, back
I would not consider you a Democratic partisan by any means. Which
me, I mean, I
yeah,
kind of am. I vote for
you think you
Democrats.
are? Okay, well, yeah, but you're also very critical of Democrats in
I'm
the
very
sense that
critical of them,
you're not a
but I
cheerleader.
mean,
Yeah,
but yeah, yeah,
yeah,
yes, I can be very critical. Um, and I think it's fine to be very critical, and it's even fine, like, people vote for all sorts of reasons and whatever. But the idea that, there's some sort of that, I mean, basically, sometimes people like Cenk will sort of make it look like, will sort of claim that like Democratic partisanship is some sort of conspiracy. That like
right.
the fact that people aren't interested in like an alternative to the incumbent, or
Or
that, Democrats aren't rallying around Marianne Williamson is like some
yeah,
sort of like, trick. And it's not a
yeah.
trick,
Or think
people
it would
just
be or just think it would be a bad idea for Biden to go through a bruising like primary, and why should he debate these people? I mean, there's no upside, there's only downside. One of the big advantages of being an incumbent is that you get to skip that part, in most
right,
instances, unless you're
right.
and also, I mean, yeah, Biden's approval, his numbers are one thing, but I think on his record, most Democrats feel pretty good about that, and that makes it difficult. If your only case is that his polls are low, I'd like to see what any other, had Elizabeth Warren won the primary, and if she was president right now, I bet her polls would probably be low because there were a lot of factors heading in to these 4 years that made it really tough. We were going to have inflation, or we were going to have really high unemployment. And Biden decided to go the way of having inflation rather than unemployment, and there's a cost to that.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that, I mean, the other thing about Biden, right, is like he keeps winning. I mean, I think that there's a lot, I mean, Democratic partisans, I mean, for lots of like pretty reasonable reasons, like put a high premium on winning. And Biden has won more national elections than like anyone alive, I mean, probably anyone alive,
Well,
right? I mean,
they weren't national elections. He won in Delaware many times over, but
but he was on the ticket with Obama.
true.
So he
Yep.
so he won two with Obama, right? And he just so and then he won like and then he won in 2020 and then he won in 2022. That's like,
Yep.
I mean, like there just aren't that many people who've done that.
And now
I mean,
he has he has an unlikely alliance with Kevin McCarthy now. Kevin's helping him out, keep the Freedom Caucus in check on the far right.
right.
So
I mean, I think people just think that, I mean, people think that like, he's won before. He's more likely to win again than Robert Kennedy Jr., I mean, and I think that that's like, I mean, on the one hand, like that's not, scientific polling. That's not like, was it really about him? I mean, not necessarily, but on the other hand, I mean, like it's like not like a crazy heuristic, right? I mean, it's not like we have like much better. It's not like somebody else has a much better way of approaching that,
right, right.
I mean,
Well, yeah.
he's like he won with Obama, he won in 2020, he won in 2022. Why would we switch? That's a reasonable question,
Yeah.
and
Well, and there's also just a very obvious point that elections are, as Biden points out, they're choices between two people, not a choice between one person and the Almighty. And so, as you were talking about earlier, I mean, we're talking on Wednesday morning. There's a non-zero chance that a federal indictment drops this week on Trump. There's still the Georgia investigation. DeSantis, I think, has his own issues just in terms of interpersonal skills and kind of retail politicking. It seems like the more people get to know him in that respect, the worse it goes. He insulates himself from any sort of interaction with mainstream press. Like, how's that going to play during
the other
debates?
issue
So, yeah,
with DeSantis winning, which I don't see people talking about much, is that like, would Trump concede? He never
probably
concedes.
not. I mean, at this point,
he never
yeah,
concedes.
I mean,
so what
right.
does that look like if there's a Republican, if DeSantis wins the Republican primary and Trump is like, no way, vote for me anyway?
Well,
right?
people also forget. I mean, remember, even when Trump is kind of on your side, it can be really bad. Because think back on those Georgia Senate races right after 2020, where it was Kelly Loeffler and Perdue, both lost in Georgia. But I remember because I was live clipping those rallies in December, and then he had one that was like 2 days before January 6th. It was like on January 4th of 21, where he was down there in Georgia ostensibly campaigning for these candidates, but the whole thing was just kind of a grievance fest, whining about the election. He like barely even mentioned these candidates. So, I could very much see him, I guess hitting the trail, quote unquote, for DeSantis, but just using it to whine about being indicted or, conspiracies against him, and it actually being quite counterproductive. So, yeah, no matter which way that goes, I think it'll be bad if Trump loses for Republicans.
Right. So, I mean, not that, and like the Republicans could win, like that would be horrible. And it's definitely something you can worry about. And I worry about it. But I mean, I just don't, this like panicked assurance that like Biden is going to doom us because his numbers aren't great right now. I mean, it's just based on nothing. It's just silliness.
Well, thanks, Noah. Really appreciate all your time this morning.
Thanks for having me on.
I had a whole suite of questions here about journalism that I plan to ask you about, but we're up against it. So I'll have to have you back on down the line to talk more about that. So
sounds good.
Thanks a lot for your time.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
That's it for today. Thanks for tuning in. New episodes of the Aaron Rupar Show drop every Thursday. Please like the show on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts and share it with your circle. Thank you for tuning in.